Rob is a distinguished, now retired, last military officer. He has about 2,300 hours in the cockpit. He was a command pilot of B-52s and B-2 bombers. In addition to all of that, he's a PhD who mastered Mandarin and served as our defense attaché in Beijing. He has spent much of the latter part of his service in uniform working on 5G and related issues concerning the competition with China, the economic unrestricted warfare with China, I should say, and including in his role as the Special Assistant to the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, was really leading the charge, and also on the National Security Council staff for a time, to try to get the kind of question that Keith just asked answered properly, if not by the politicians, certainly by the government of the United States. I'm glad you're here, General.
Thank you. So I'll be brief. I think what you have to begin to do is understand how essentially China re-engineered the globalization and the internet to actually achieve dominance in a lot of different areas. And 5G is just the latest example of that. And really, so a lot of the comments that the senator just made, I absolutely agree with. The challenge is that the Chinese Communist Party actually watched how that developed in our system after the end of the Cold War. And I would say prior to the end of the Cold War, there was a tight alignment. There was a connectivity between free market principles and democratic principles that actually was broken when the wall came down. And the reason it was broken is because there was this theory that if we just pressed open markets everywhere, that as countries developed economically, that once those populations reached somewhere between $6,000 and $8,000 median income, that they would liberalize politically. Okay, and you could make the argument that prior to June 4th, 1989, that those kinds of effects were actually happening in China. The problem is the Chinese Communist Party realized it and then began to re-engineer the system in its favor. So one of the things that America has enjoyed, and one of the reasons it's been successful over 240 years, is because there's been this very tight alignment here between private profit motive and national interest. In other words, if you were doing well in your business, the country was doing well. And it's all about setting the incentive system. And so what happened was China understood if it could incentivize corporate behavior around its own national interests, that it could beat the U.S. at its own game. The Soviet Union tried to direct economic activity down at the unit level. It's completely impossible. You have to let people be people, do things in their own interests. The Chinese Communist Party figured this out. What they did is they drew very hard lines in the road in terms of what's the art of the possible, in terms of what you can do, but everything else in between those lines is absolutely 100% permissible. And more importantly, we're going to use our large market and the financial reserves from a society that saves essentially 50% of their income. And we're going to use that to not only incentivize our companies to do what we want them to do, we're going to incentivize the rest of corporate activity outside. And so in other words, today, if you're doing well in America, China's getting stronger. If you're doing well in Europe, China's getting stronger. If you're doing well in Africa, China's getting stronger. Now, there are so many aspects to this that we could literally sit here for a couple of days and talk about in each area how they've engineered that. There's a lot of people that talked about it last week in New York, but essentially we come to the point is, where are we going in the 21st century? And what we said in the National Security Strategy is that data is a strategic resource, particularly because in our system, in our IT-based system, data aggregation is very easy. The accumulation of data in our system today is equivalent to the accumulation of power. And so who is accumulating power in the current internet age? Large tech companies and totalitarian regimes. Why? Because they can aggregate data. Now you say, okay, well, but we can't do anything with that data. Well, then you introduce machine learning and artificial intelligence. So when you combine large amounts of data, social networks, machine learning and artificial intelligence, you begin to do things like global surveillance, targeted influence. And then when you build a 5G network that's built not for us, by the way, but for machines, you start introducing machines into that danger mix. So global surveillance, targeted influence, and when self-driving cars and farm equipment and drones and all these other things start to attach to the network, the ability to control those to do what you want to, which will increase the ability to do surveillance, will help you do targeted influence, but it also, in cases, will be able to be used to kill people. I mean, that's just the truth. The Internet of Things today are cameras, and we know that those cameras have very little security. Absolutely little security. When in fact there's stories all the time how somebody's hacking in the cameras or using botnets to take control of the cameras and use them for DDoS attacks. That's completely available today. It's just going to increase exponentially with the introduction of 5G. So what is 5G? Well, for one thing, you go from 10,000 connected devices per square mile to 3 million connected devices per square mile. So if you think you have a threat landscape today, what do you think is going to happen when we start rolling out 5G networks? So when we talked about this in the National Security Strategy, we said we're going to build a nationwide secure 5G network. Now there was two parts to that. One, we realized that if you're building 5G networks in a country like America, we probably shouldn't leave the rural America behind, right? But if you look at the spectrum policy that we're using today, that's exactly what we're doing. We're building 5G networks in dense urban areas. We're not building in rural because if you talk to not an economist or a policy expert or any of the other people here in DC that don't actually understand engineering, you'll find that millimeter wave is not sufficient for building a nationwide network. In fact, it's extremely poor for that. In fact, what you need and what every other country in the world is using is mid-band. But because we have such a slow bureaucratic process and nobody has realized the almost crisis nature of what we're running into here, we're just slowly rolling out that mid-band. In fact, we're on a path that the Defense Innovation Board told the Department of Defense, now this is an unclassified report, go to the internet and look it up, told our Department of Defense that you need to be prepared to be in a post-Western internet world. What does that mean? Chinese cybersecurity standard says you must put backdoor in your hardware, in your software for the Chinese domestic market. Now, what's happening? As that global architecture gets built out, that global infrastructure, because Huawei is leading the effort with subsidized equipment, subsidized installation, and subsidized financing, those standards also come out too. That means your phones have backdoors in them because it's too hard to have a code base for China and a code base for the rest of the world. And it's much easier, by the way, if you have a code base that you can share everywhere, which is why it was such a boon for the United States when we won in 4G, right? So now that's why the Chinese Communist Party said, let's win in 5G, and we can deploy our global standards. Those global standards mandate that you're going to have backdoors placed in it. Go read the Chinese cybersecurity law. Okay, so it's all in there. And, I would just say that if you're going to ask a question about what we should do with regard to 5G policy, it's probably behoove you to talk to an engineer that actually builds the networks to understand. Now, if you want to go and see a report that actually has a lot of engineering in it, you can go look at the Defense Innovation Board report. You can go look at the report that was leaked that I wrote, because there are certain elements in this country that don't actually want you to know the truth.